A stranger in the storm. Michael Harrison sat in the back of his chauffeured Rolls-Royce, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window as the city blurred past him in a haze of neon lights and shadows. The storm outside mirrored the quiet turmoil within him, an endless downpour that refused to cease. It had been a long day, meetings with investors, legal discussions, and a dinner event he barely had the patience for. At 52, Michael had everything a man could desire: wealth, power, and a reputation that commanded respect. Yet, as he adjusted the gold cufflinks on his crisp white shirt, he felt none of it mattered. 10 years. It had been 10 long years since Elizabeth passed away. She had been his soul, the only person who saw the man beneath the billionaire title. Without her, life had become a machine, cold, calculated, and relentless. His mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, was a fortress of luxury, but it was also a tomb filled with echoes of a love he could never replace. "Mr. Harrison, do you want to take the usual route or go through the Market District?" his driver, James, asked from the front seat. Michael hesitated. He barely paid attention to routes, he left those decisions to others. But tonight, something in him stirred. "The Market District," he said, surprising even himself. The car turned onto a street Michael had not visited in years. The Market District was once a thriving hub, but over the years, it had fallen into disrepair. The wealthy seldom passed through here, except when looking for cheap labor. Michael watched as neon signs flickered over small diners, pawn shops, and worn-down apartments. A few figures huddled under awnings, shielding themselves from the rain. It was a world he had left behind long ago. As they stopped at a red light, Michael's eyes caught movement near a grocery store. A woman stood there, her arms wrapped around a bundled-up child. The streetlight above cast a dim glow on her, revealing exhaustion in her eyes. She wore a thin jacket, drenched from the rain, and her hands trembled as she counted a few crumpled bills in her palm. The grocery store clerk, a middle-aged man with a hard face, shook his head. "That's not enough," he said. "Please," the woman begged. "I just need some milk and bread. My baby, he hasn't eaten since morning." Michael watched as the clerk folded his arms. "I'm running a business, lady. If you don't have the money, I can't help you." A flicker of something long buried stirred in Michael's chest. Without thinking, he opened the car door, stepping into the downpour. James turned in surprise. "Sir?" Michael ignored him. He crossed the street, rain soaking his expensive suit. The woman's eyes widened as he approached, clutching the small bundle closer to her chest as if expecting trouble. "How much does she owe?" Michael asked, his voice calm but firm. The clerk squinted at him. "Who's asking?" Michael pulled out his wallet and handed the man a $100 bill. "That should cover whatever she needs." The woman gasped. "Sir, I can't take this." Michael met her gaze. Her face, though weary, was striking. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with deep brown skin and eyes filled with both gratitude and hesitation. Her cheekbones were sharp, her lips slightly chapped from the cold. The child in her arms stirred, a baby, no older than a few months. "Buy what you need," Michael said simply. Tears welled in the woman's eyes, but she nodded, rushing inside to grab food and baby formula. Michael waited, ignoring the curious glances from passers-by. When she returned, cradling a small bag of groceries, she looked up at him with unspoken gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means to me." Michael nodded. He wasn't sure why he had intervened, perhaps a sense of duty, or maybe it was something deeper, something he wasn't ready to face. "What's your name?" he asked. "Naomi," she said. "And this is my son, Elijah." Michael glanced at the baby, who let out a soft, contented sigh in his mother's arms. He felt something tighten in his chest. He had never had children of his own. Elizabeth had wanted them, but fate had been cruel. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked. Naomi hesitated. I have a place, but it's not much. I just lost my job, and rent is due soon. But I'll manage." Michael didn't believe that. He saw the way she held herself, the quiet dignity masking deep despair. He reached into his pocket again and handed her another stack of bills. "This should help for a while." Her lips parted in shock. "I can't." "Yes, you can," he interrupted. "Take it." "For Elijah." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she clutched the money. "You're a good man, sir." Michael almost laughed at that. He didn't feel like a good man. But for the first time in years, he felt something other than emptiness. "Get home safe," he said before turning back toward his car. As he slid into the seat, James gave him a knowing look. "That was kind of you, sir." Michael said nothing. He wasn't sure why he had done it. Maybe because, for a moment, he had seen Elizabeth in that young woman's eyes, the same strength, the same quiet determination. As the car pulled away, he took one last glance in the mirror. Naomi stood there in the rain, clutching her son close, watching as he disappeared into the night. What Michael didn't know was that fate wasn't done with their paths just yet. A grave encounter. Michael Harrison awoke the next morning with an unfamiliar feeling, a sense of purpose that had eluded him for years. The encounter with Naomi and her infant son the night before lingered in his mind like an echo from a dream. It had been a long time since he had stepped outside his carefully curated world of business and wealth to interact with someone struggling just to survive. Something about the young mother had struck a chord within him, but he couldn't quite explain why. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, Michael went through his morning routine mechanically: black coffee, a quick glance at stock reports, a brief nod at his house staff before dismissing them. His mansion, though filled with the finest things money could buy, still felt cavernous and cold. He had grown used to that. But today, the silence weighed heavier than usual. Something in him urged him to step outside, to take a drive. He rarely allowed himself such spontaneous indulgences, but for some reason, he found himself walking toward the garage. His Rolls-Royce was waiting, but instead of summoning his driver, he slid into the driver's seat himself. He hadn't driven in years. As he navigated through the streets of Greenwich, he found himself heading toward an old, familiar destination, the cemetery where Elizabeth was buried. He hadn't visited in a while. Not because he had forgotten her, but because it was too painful to stand before the cold stone reminder of what he had lost. The road stretched before him, leading him past the wealthier parts of town and into the quieter, somber grounds of the cemetery. The rain from the previous night had left the air crisp, and the morning sun barely peeked through the gray clouds overhead. Pulling up near the entrance, Michael turned off the car and exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure what had drawn him here today, but he didn't fight it. He stepped out and made his way through the rows of tombstones, his polished shoes crunching against the damp grass. Then, he saw her. Naomi. She stood just a few feet from Elizabeth's grave, her baby cradled in her arms. The sight of her here sent a jolt through him, a confusion that quickly turned into intrigue. Why was she here? Had she followed him? Was this some sort of elaborate ploy? But as he observed her, he realized she hadn't even noticed him. She wasn't standing at Elizabeth's grave, she was at the one beside it. A smaller, simpler tombstone. Michael hesitated before stepping closer. He wasn't sure why, but something in the way she held herself, the way her shoulders trembled as she stared at the stone, made him pause. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, uncertain. Naomi? She gasped and turned abruptly, her eyes wide with surprise. The moment she recognized him, her expression shifted from shock to something unreadable. Mr. Harrison, she murmured. He took another step forward, his gaze flickering from her face to the grave beside Elizabeth's. The name etched into the stone made his breath catch in his throat. Marcus A. Thompson. 1985 to 2023. Beloved son, brother, and father. Michael felt a strange sense of recognition, though the name didn't immediately register. You knew him? He asked. Naomi swallowed hard, nodding. She looked down at the baby in her arms, adjusting his tiny blanket before speaking. He was my fiancé, she admitted softly. Elijah's father. Michael stared at the name again, something clicking in his mind. Thompson. The name wasn't unfamiliar to him. He had employed many people over the years, but suddenly, he remembered a bright young man who had worked in one of his finance firms, someone with promise. Marcus Thompson, he said, the memory surfacing. He worked for me, didn't he? Naomi nodded. Yes. He did. Michael felt a strange weight settle over him. He had never personally known all of his employees, especially in a company as vast as his, but he remembered hearing about Marcus, a hard-working man with a future in finance. I heard about an accident, Michael murmured, the pieces falling into place. It happened last year, didn't it? Naomi's hands trembled slightly as she nodded again. A car crash. He was on his way home from work. A drunk driver ran a red light. Michael felt something in his chest tighten. He had heard about Marcus's death through company briefings, but it had been just another passing report at the time, buried under a pile of other news. He had never thought about the family left behind. Now, as he stood here, looking at the woman Marcus had loved and the child he had never gotten the chance to raise, Michael felt a pang of guilt. I'm sorry, he said, and for once, the words didn't feel hollow. Naomi gave him a sad smile. It's been hard. Marcus was everything to me. We were supposed to get married after Elijah was born. But then, she glanced at the tombstone again, her voice trailing off. Michael found himself looking at Elijah. The baby stirred slightly in his sleep, his tiny hands curling into fists. He was too young to understand any of this, too young to know the loss he had already suffered. I didn't know, Michael admitted. I wish I had. Naomi nodded. Not many people did. After Marcus passed, everything fell apart. I lost our apartment. I had to move into a shelter for a while. I tried to get work, but with Elijah being so young, it's been difficult. She laughed bitterly. You probably didn't expect to see me here, did you? Michael shook his head. No. But I think, maybe I was meant to. A silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant rustling of trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. Then, Michael did something he hadn't planned. Something instinctive. Come with me, he said. Naomi blinked. What? You and Elijah. Let me help you. He wasn't sure what had prompted the offer, only that he couldn't just walk away. Naomi looked hesitant. Mr. Harrison, you've already done more than enough. You don't have to. I want to, he interrupted, his voice firm. Marcus worked for me. He was part of my company, part of my responsibility. And now, so are you and Elijah. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of pity or obligation. But there was none. There was only sincerity. Finally, she exhaled slowly. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Michael said simply. Naomi looked down at her son, then back at the grave of the man she had loved. A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time, there was something else in her expression, something that looked like hope. And for the first time in years, Michael felt the same. A new beginning. Naomi sat in the passenger seat of Michael's Rolls-Royce, clutching Elijah tightly against her chest as the car moved smoothly through the streets of Greenwich. The weight of the morning's encounter at the cemetery still lingered in her heart, but the warmth of the baby in her arms and the unexpected kindness from this stranger gave her a feeling she had long forgotten: hope. She stole a glance at Michael, who remained silent as he drove, his face unreadable. She had heard his name before, had seen his face on the covers of business magazines while waiting in bank lines, or in the background of news reports about billion-dollar deals. He was a man of power, a man who had everything. And yet, he had stopped for her son. It still didn't make sense. "Mr. Harrison," she finally spoke, her voice careful, uncertain. "Why are you doing this?" Michael kept his eyes on the road, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. "I don't know," he admitted after a pause. "Maybe because I should have done something sooner. Maybe because I can." He glanced at her briefly. "Or maybe because I see something in you that reminds me of someone I lost." Naomi didn't press further. She could hear the weight in his voice, the grief buried deep but not forgotten. She understood that feeling all too well. The car pulled through an iron gate, winding up a long driveway before stopping in front of an enormous estate. Naomi's breath caught as she took in the mansion before her. It looked like something out of a dream, towering and elegant with stone pathways leading to grand wooden doors. The garden was pristine, with hedges sculpted to perfection. It was the kind of place she had only seen in movies. "This is your home," she whispered. Michael turned off the car. "It's just a house," he said. Naomi wasn't sure if she believed that. A house like this was more than just walls and windows. It was wealth, security, things she had struggled to provide for Elijah since Marcus's death. Michael stepped out, and James, the driver from the night before, quickly approached to open Naomi's door. She hesitated before stepping out, holding Elijah close. "This way," Michael said, leading her through the grand entrance. The inside of the mansion was even more breathtaking. Marble floors stretched across a vast hall, with high ceilings and chandeliers that glowed softly overhead. Naomi noticed the walls were adorned with artwork, the kind she had seen in museums, and yet there was something strangely empty about the place. It was beautiful, yes. But it was lonely. Michael walked ahead, his steps confident but lacking enthusiasm, as if he were merely following a routine. "I'll have the guest room prepared for you and Elijah," he said. "You can stay here until you figure out what's next." Naomi stiffened. She had never expected anything more than a few dollars, maybe a meal. But now, he was offering her a place in his home. "I can't impose like this," she said quickly. "You've already done too much." Michael turned to face her. "Do you have somewhere else to go?" She bit her lip. I was staying with a friend, but it's not permanent. I was hoping to find work soon and get my own place." He studied her for a moment before nodding. "Then think of this as temporary. A safe place for you and your son until you're back on your feet." Naomi wanted to refuse. She had spent the past year surviving on her own, learning to expect nothing from anyone. Accepting charity had always felt like a debt she couldn't repay. But this wasn't just about her. It was about Elijah. And for the first time in months, she felt like she didn't have to be afraid of what tomorrow would bring. "Okay," she said softly. Michael nodded, as if he had expected her answer. He turned to James. "Take Naomi to the East Wing. Make sure she has everything she needs." James gave a small smile and gestured for Naomi to follow. "Right this way, miss." She hesitated, glancing at Michael one last time. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Michael simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "Rest. We'll talk tomorrow." As Naomi disappeared down the hall, Michael let out a slow breath. He hadn't planned for any of this. He hadn't planned on meeting her, or seeing Marcus's grave, or bringing a stranger into his home. But as he looked up at the large portrait of Elizabeth hanging in the hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, this was exactly what she would have wanted. A new life. Naomi had never slept in a bed so soft before. She lay in the guest bedroom, staring at the ceiling, still unable to fully believe where she was. The room was larger than her entire apartment had been. A fireplace flickered quietly in the corner, casting a warm glow over the elegant furniture. The scent of fresh linens surrounded her, and for the first time in months, she felt clean, comfortable, and safe. Elijah slept soundly beside her in a crib James had brought in. He had eaten, bathed, and now lay wrapped in a blanket, his tiny face relaxed in sleep. Naomi reached out, gently brushing a curl from his forehead. They were safe. For the first time in a long time, she didn't have to worry about how she would buy food for the next day, or where they would sleep. She didn't have to wonder if her son would go hungry. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were different from the ones she had shed the night before. These weren't tears of despair. They were tears of relief. But beneath the relief, there was something else. A question. Why had Michael done this? A man like him had no reason to help a woman like her. He had the kind of wealth and power that allowed him to turn away from people like her without a second thought. And yet, he hadn't. There was something in his eyes, something in the way he carried himself that told her this wasn't just about generosity. It was about something deeper. She needed to understand him. Naomi closed her eyes, holding Elijah's tiny hand as she whispered softly, "Maybe this is the beginning of something new, baby." And as sleep took her, she couldn't help but wonder. Was this just a temporary kindness? Or was Michael Harrison about to change their lives forever? Echoes of the past. The next morning, Naomi awoke to the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the sheer curtains of the guest room. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The comfort of the plush mattress beneath her, the warmth of the thick blanket wrapped around her body, it all felt too luxurious, too far from the life she had been living. Then, the sound of Elijah's soft cooing brought her back to reality. She turned her head to see her son kicking his tiny legs in the crib, a sleepy smile on his face. Relief flooded her heart. He looked happy, safe. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the same. A gentle knock on the door startled her. "Miss Naomi?" James's voice carried through the door. She quickly sat up, smoothing her hair. "Yes? I've brought breakfast. Mr. Harrison asked me to let you know that he would like to speak with you in his study after you've eaten." Naomi hesitated. She still wasn't sure what to make of all this. Was Michael expecting something in return? Had she unknowingly agreed to something she couldn't repay? But then she looked at Elijah, his small hands grasping at the air, his innocent eyes staring up at her, and she knew she had no choice but to see this through. "Thank you, James. I'll be down soon." After dressing in the fresh clothes that had been left in the room, a simple but elegant sweater and jeans that actually fit her, Naomi made her way downstairs, following James through the vast corridors of the mansion. The house was stunning, but it felt empty. The halls were filled with expensive paintings, intricate sculptures, and furniture that probably cost more than she had made in her entire life. Yet, there was no warmth, no laughter, no sign of life beyond the occasional staff member moving quietly through the rooms. She wondered how long Michael had lived like this. James stopped in front of a large wooden door, knocking gently before opening it. "Mr. Harrison, Miss Naomi is here." Michael was seated behind an enormous mahogany desk, surrounded by shelves lined with books. The room had a masculine, classic feel, deep brown leather chairs, dark wooden floors, and a fireplace that crackled softly in the background. He looked up from a document he had been reading, gesturing for her to sit in the chair across from him. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. Naomi nodded as she sat down. "Yes. Thank you. And thank you for everything." Michael studied her for a moment before leaning back in his chair. "I wanted to check on you." Make sure you and Elijah are comfortable. We are, she said softly. More than I can say for the past year. He nodded but didn't respond immediately. There was something about the way he was looking at her, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle that only he could see. Finally, he said, I don't believe in coincidences, Naomi. She frowned slightly. What do you mean? He exhaled, his gaze distant. I don't think it was an accident that I ran into you last night. Or that I found you at the cemetery this morning. Of all the people I could have helped, of all the streets I could have driven down, I ended up crossing paths with you. Naomi wasn't sure how to respond. I knew your fiancé, he continued. Not personally, but I remember him. Marcus was a bright man. He had potential. Her throat tightened. He was. Michael was silent for a moment before he spoke again, his voice softer. When my wife passed, I drowned myself in work. I stopped caring about people. I stopped caring about life outside of my company. He looked at her then, his eyes sharper. But seeing you at that grave yesterday, it made me realize how much I had turned away from the world. How much I had ignored the people I should have helped. Naomi swallowed. You don't owe me anything, Mr. Harrison. He raised an eyebrow. Don't I? She shook her head. No. You've already done more for me than I ever could have expected. Michael leaned forward slightly. And what if I want to do more? Naomi froze. What? I don't just want to give you a place to sleep or money to survive, he said firmly. I want to give you a future. A real one. Naomi stared at him, unsure whether to feel grateful or terrified. I've seen too many people with potential waste away because no one gave them a chance, Michael continued. I don't want that to happen to you. But why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He was silent for a moment before answering. Because I think Elizabeth would have wanted me to. Naomi felt her heart tighten. He wasn't just helping her out of pity, he was trying to fill a void in his own life. She understood that kind of pain, the need to do something, anything, to make sense of loss. But could she accept it? Let me help you find work, Michael offered. Something that will allow you to support Elijah on your own. Let me make sure you don't have to struggle anymore. Naomi took a deep breath. Everything in her screamed to say no, to refuse the offer and find her own way. But then she thought about Elijah. If Michael was giving her an opportunity to provide her son with a stable life, how could she walk away from that? Okay, she said finally. But only if I earn it. Michael's lips quirked into the smallest hint of a smile. I wouldn't have it any other way. New paths, old wounds. For the next week, Naomi found herself adjusting to a life she never thought she would experience. Michael had arranged for her to meet with potential employers, each one offering a position that could allow her to rebuild her life. And yet, the more she got to know him, the more she saw past the cold exterior he presented to the world. Michael Harrison wasn't just a wealthy man, he was a man burdened by grief, by loneliness. His house was filled with memories of a love lost too soon, and despite his power and status, Naomi could see that he was just as lost as she had been. Late one evening, after putting Elijah to sleep, she wandered through the halls of the mansion, pausing by the large portrait of Elizabeth. She was beautiful, Naomi said softly. Michael, who had just stepped into the hallway, stopped beside her. She was, he agreed. Naomi looked at him then. You loved her. Michael nodded, his jaw tightening. More than anything. Naomi hesitated before saying, do you think she would have approved of me being here? Michael turned to look at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his expression that she hadn't seen before, acceptance. I think, he said quietly, that she would have been the one to bring you here if I hadn't. Naomi felt something shift between them then. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about healing. For both of them, breaking the barriers. The days turned into weeks, and Naomi found herself slowly adjusting to the unexpected rhythm of her new life. What had started as an act of kindness from a stranger had turned into something far more complex. She was no longer just a woman struggling to survive, she was learning, growing, and finding a place in a world that had once seemed out of reach. Michael had kept his word. He had arranged for her to meet with business contacts who were willing to give her a fair chance. Not out of charity, but because she had skills, real skills. Before Marcus's death, Naomi had studied finance, hoping to work alongside him someday. But after he was gone, the weight of survival had forced her to abandon those dreams. Now, for the first time in over a year, she had hope again. But despite the security Michael had given her, there was still an invisible wall between them. He was kind, but distant. Generous, but guarded. No matter how much she tried to understand him, there was always a part of Michael Harrison that seemed untouchable, locked behind grief and years of solitude. And Naomi wasn't sure how to break through. An unfinished symphony. One evening, after putting Elijah to sleep, Naomi wandered through the mansion, trying to familiarize herself with the vast, empty halls. She had always been in awe of the house's beauty, but the more time she spent there, the more she saw it for what it truly was, a lonely fortress built by a man who had tried to fill the silence with wealth. As she walked past one of the many doors, a soft sound caught her attention. Music. She hesitated for a moment before following the melody, stopping outside a half-open door. Inside, Michael sat at a grand piano, his fingers gliding effortlessly over the keys. The notes were haunting, filled with an aching beauty that made Naomi's heart clench. She didn't move, afraid that if he saw her, he would stop. But he did. Michael's hands stilled as he turned to find her standing in the doorway. His expression flickered between surprise and something else, something unreadable. "You play?" she asked softly. Michael exhaled, his fingers brushing over the keys absent-mindedly. "I used to." Naomi stepped inside, drawn to the sadness in his voice. "That was beautiful." He gave a small, almost bitter smile. "It was Elizabeth's favorite piece. She always asked me to play it." Naomi's chest tightened. "You haven't played since she passed?" Michael hesitated before shaking his head. "Not like this. Sometimes, I sit here, but I never finish the song." Naomi studied him carefully. He was always so composed, so controlled, but in this moment, he looked lost. "She wouldn't have wanted you to stop," she said gently. Michael looked at her then, really looked at her. "How do you know what she would have wanted?" Naomi swallowed. "Because Marcus wouldn't have wanted me to stop living either. But I did. For a long time." A silence stretched between them, filled only by the unspoken grief that connected them in ways neither of them had expected. Finally, Michael turned back to the piano. His fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before he played the next note, continuing the song. This time, he didn't stop. And Naomi stayed, listening. More than gratitude. As the weeks passed, Naomi found herself drawn to Michael in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper. She had seen the man behind the billionaire title, the man who carried his pain in silence, who had spent years pushing the world away. And now, despite his walls, he had let her and Elijah into his life. One afternoon, as they sat in the sunroom watching Elijah play on the floor, Naomi found herself asking a question she had been avoiding. "Michael, what was Elizabeth like?" He glanced at her, surprised. He rarely spoke about his wife in detail, and she had never wanted to push him. But today, she saw something in his expression that made her think he was ready. "She was everything I wasn't," he said after a moment. "Kind, warm, she saw the good in people even when I didn't." Naomi smiled. "She sounds wonderful." She was, Michael agreed, his gaze distant. She was the reason I believed in anything beyond business. After she was gone, I didn't see the point anymore. Naomi hesitated before saying, "But you're still here." Michael looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't grief. "I am," he murmured. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to say something, to break the tension between them, but before she could, Elijah let out a happy squeal, breaking the moment. Michael chuckled, reaching down to pick up the baby. Elijah giggled as Michael lifted him into the air, his tiny hands grabbing at his shirt. Naomi watched them, warmth blooming in her chest. She had never expected this. She had never expected him. And suddenly, she realized. She wasn't just rebuilding her life. She was building something new. Something with him. And that terrified her. The breaking point. But nothing good lasts forever. Late one evening, as Naomi was preparing for bed, she overheard a conversation that sent ice through her veins. She had been walking past Michael's study when she heard James's voice. "She's getting comfortable here, sir." Naomi froze. Michael's voice followed, low and firm. "That's the point, James." There was a pause. "Are you sure this is about helping her?" James asked. "Or are you trying to fill a void?" Naomi's breath caught. She shouldn't be listening. She knew that. But she couldn't stop. Michael exhaled. "I don't know," he admitted. Naomi's heart clenched. James hesitated before continuing. "And what happens when she realizes she was just a replacement?" Naomi felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. A replacement. Is that what she was to him? A way to ease the loneliness he had carried since Elizabeth's death? Suddenly, everything, the kindness, the generosity, the way he looked at her, felt tainted. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't be someone's shadow. Tears burned her eyes as she turned away, retreating to her room. She had thought she was finding a home. But maybe, she had just been living in someone else's past. And maybe, it was time to leave. Walking away, finding home. The mansion felt different now. The warmth Naomi had begun to feel, the fragile hope that had started to take root, was gone, replaced by a deep, aching hollowness. She had spent weeks convincing herself that what she and Michael were building was real. That his kindness was more than an obligation. That he saw her as Naomi, not as a substitute for Elizabeth. But now, as she sat in the dim light of her guest room, staring at the packed bag on the floor, she felt foolish for believing in something so fragile. Elijah slept peacefully in the crib beside her, unaware of the storm raging in her heart. She reached out, gently brushing his cheek. They had come so far. But now, they had to leave. Before she lost herself in something that was never meant to be hers. A silent goodbye. Naomi waited until dawn. She had thought about telling Michael she was leaving, but she couldn't face him, not after what she had overheard. He had given her and Elijah a place to stay, a fresh start, and she would always be grateful. But she couldn't live in someone else's shadow. Taking one last look at the elegant room that had sheltered her, she took a deep breath, lifted Elijah into her arms, and quietly slipped out the door. The house was silent as she made her way down the grand staircase, her heart pounding with every step. She almost made it to the door. Almost. Naomi. She froze. Michael stood at the entrance to the hallway, his expression unreadable. He was dressed casually, his shirt slightly unbuttoned, as if he hadn't been able to sleep. His eyes flickered to the bag in her hand. "You're leaving." It wasn't a question. Naomi swallowed hard, tightening her grip on Elijah. "Yes." A tense silence filled the air between them. Michael exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Is this about last night?" Naomi forced herself to meet his gaze. I heard you, Michael. I heard what James said. I heard what you said. Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. I can't stay here, knowing I'm just filling a void for you. Michael stiffened. Is that what you think this is? What else would it be? She shot back, her emotions breaking through. You lost your wife, and then suddenly, I come along, and you open your home to me. You tell me you want to help me, that you want to give me a future, but is it really about me? Or am I just the closest thing to what you lost? Michael's jaw clenched. That's not fair. Naomi's throat tightened. Isn't it? For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he admitted, I don't know. Naomi's breath caught. She had been hoping he would deny it, that he would fight for her, for them. But instead, all he could give her was uncertainty. That was her answer. Blinking back tears, she adjusted Elijah in her arms. Goodbye, Michael. She turned to leave. But before she could step through the door, Michael's voice stopped her. I was lost before I met you, Naomi. She hesitated. He took a slow step forward. When Elizabeth died, I stopped believing in anything. In love, in people. In myself. And for a long time, I thought I was fine that way. He exhaled. Then I met you. Naomi turned, her eyes searching his face. I don't know if what I feel is because of Elizabeth, he admitted. But I know that when you and Elijah came into my life, the silence stopped. His voice was raw, vulnerable. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. Naomi's heart ached. Michael. He shook his head. I can't promise you that I have all the answers. I don't know what this is yet. But I know I don't want you to leave. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I can't stay here if I'm just a reminder of what you lost. You're not, he said firmly. You're a reminder of what I still have. Naomi inhaled sharply. For the first time, she saw it, the fear in his eyes. The fear of losing her. But was it enough? She looked down at Elijah, at the tiny life she was responsible for. Then, back at Michael. I need to stand on my own, Michael, she whispered. I need to know that if I stay, it's because I chose to, not because I had nowhere else to go. Michael nodded slowly. Then let me help you. One last time. Naomi frowned. What do you mean? Let me set you up with a job, a home, whatever you need to get on your feet. His voice was steady. Not because I want you to stay. But because I want you to have a choice. Tears welled in her eyes again. She had spent so long fighting to survive, so long believing that she had to do everything alone. But Michael wasn't offering her charity. He was offering her freedom. A choice. After a long silence, she nodded. Okay. 6 months later. The city skyline stretched out before her, golden in the evening light. Naomi leaned against the balcony of her new apartment, watching as the world moved below. It had been 6 months since she left Michael's mansion. 6 months since she had started her new job in finance, built a stable home for Elijah, and found herself again. And yet, he was still there, in the back of her mind. They had kept in touch. Occasionally. A text here, a phone call there. He never pushed, never asked her to come back. He had kept his promise. She had stood on her own. But now, as she sat alone in the quiet of her apartment, she wondered. Had she made the right choice? As if the universe had heard her thoughts, her phone buzzed. Michael's name flashed across the screen. Her heart pounded as she answered. Michael? A pause. Then, his voice, steady, warm. Are you happy, Naomi? She swallowed hard. I'm getting there. Michael was silent for a moment. Me too. Naomi closed her eyes. Maybe love wasn't about filling the spaces left by loss. Maybe it was about finding new spaces, new beginnings. And maybe, just maybe, their story wasn't over yet.